Hi, my name is Josie Myers. I'm a new master's student at Kent State University, but this presentation is actually my senior capstone research I completed at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire with Dr. Ezra Zeitler as my faculty mentor, titled Representing a State, Shifting Themes in Minnesota's Official State Highway Map. I must acknowledge where this research took place, acknowledging that UW-Eau Claire occupies the sacred and ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples. We honor the land of the Ojibwa and Dakota nations. So the big question to start off with, why study state highway maps? Well, overall, the maps themselves and the tourism imagery within them are a good indicator of the state in the time period the maps were produced, reflecting values and serving as tourism information. The obvious use of the maps, of course, is for basic navigation, but states have also taken advantage of the ubiquitous nature of these maps to employ them as promotional tools for the interests of the state government by devoting a portion of the reverse sides for photos and text. Our study identified the changing themes emphasized in Minnesota highway maps over the past century and how these themes highlight overall representation and how the state paints itself. So the main research question was to look at how graphic representations of society have changed over time in Minnesota's official highway maps, especially in concerns to race and gender. The follow-up question was to try and use what we learned from our study to inform the creation of a feminist state highway map that will be able to more accurately represent the state's people, environment, and economy. To look at feminist geographies in relation to this promotional information in the maps themselves, I looked to Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein's work on feminist data visualization. Feminist geography focuses on representation and the inequalities within it, as well as the emotions that come with these representations. When it comes to spatial representation and computer GIS-produced maps, human beings are often represented in a positivist way, as points on a map and quantifiable objects, completely disconnecting people from geographic phenomena that are inherently human-related. However, feminist geography and critical GIS argue that representation in maps should not discount emotions and should strive to be human-centered to benefit the user. Due to this disconnect and the objectivity and lack of reflexivity within scientific research, mapping has always exhibited a masculine tone presented by individuals and institutions in positions of power. Feminist cartography has changed the way people are represented by incorporating different considerations of power, context, and pluralism to mapping. We're able to look at maps today with a critical feminist lens because of work done in the past by critical geographers. In order to complete this study, we were able to use the Minnesota Reflections Library, which is an online repository that hosts scanned images of every Minnesota state highway map in the past 100 years. Analyzing close to 100 maps was too much for the scale of a senior capstone, so we chose 13 maps that represented the years well, some of which you can see here. We used content analysis, which in short is a research tool that can be used to compare graphically heavy subjects such as maps to compare patterns, themes, and repetition in symbology and content. When designing our analysis, we used a feminist lens to focus the categories and kept in mind the principles of feminist data visualization. In the case of this study, the aim was to investigate the ways that people and the environment were portrayed in tourism imagery published by the state to discern any patterns that emerge, as well as to study cartographic and content themes over time. We created classes to quantitatively count on each map the number of times certain people, groups, and features were portrayed and how they were portrayed. The table on the slide here shows the breadth of classes we created for our content analysis of tourism imagery. This process was done 3 times, once for tourism imagery, once for cartographic themes, and once on the map's legends. Overall, this analysis of thematic imagery on the 13 sampled maps reveals a continued emphasis of Minnesota's natural amenities that varied in intensity as the state's road network developed and the Twin Cities rose in national prominence. Representation of people included women as passive participants in tourism activities, problematic representation of the state's Indigenous people, and overrepresentation of white men, women, and children. Our content analysis revealed that the most popular image location was the Boundary Waters and North Woods, followed by the Mississippi River and Twin Cities. The most popular economic activities were tourism and transportation infrastructure, with a few mentions of forestry, mining, and agriculture. Arguably the most notable pattern is the lack of representation of individuals who do not fall into the heterosexual white male category. Women, people of color, differently abled individuals, and folks in the LGBTQ community comprise a very small or non-existent amount of representation in map content. Men are often portrayed as rugged and masculine in the great outdoors, while women are shown inactive and just looking nice. By later decades, the imagery becomes more inclusive by showing women in active roles, but still there are maps that do not contain a representation of women at all. This begs the question of whether men or women are the designers of this tourism imagery. In addition, the sample of 13 maps included very little representation of people of color. When present, many images of people of color included Indigenous people, with the images always paired with captions or supplementary graphics meant to explain differences. Other people of color represented in the sampled maps, and you can literally count them on one hand, include 3 separate maps with 3 separate African American people recreating. This is the representation that exists in the state highway maps, while overall about 20% of Minnesota's actual population identifies as a person of color. A complete lack of obvious representation of LGBTQ folks and those with differing abilities, as well as the minimal representation of people of color, brings into question how this representation impacts perceptions of Minnesota. So the next step was to dive into the maps themselves, the actual navigational portion. I found themes particularly in colors used and decorative elements, or lack thereof. Considering cartographic history, early maps were drafted by hand, and many decorative elements were included even in simple maps. You can see this here in the title plates and borders used in early maps compared to those of the 1970s and after. The early maps included official cartography credits, which eventually were removed when the Department of Transportation took over, which coincided with the maps transitioning to a less decorative, more technical look. The intensity of color also changed over time, starting with saturated reds, blues, and yellows, but with the switch to the computer, the map switched to pastels. The number of colors used in the map elements increased as well, leading to very crowded maps with a plethora of information. Here's a side-by-side of an early and more recent map to compare themes. In general, elements on the map have grown in number from 1936 to today. For example, in Otter Tail County in northwestern Minnesota had the number of lakes displayed on the map jump from 78 to 181 between 1960 and 1965. Judging by map style, this was also when more automated mapping processes were introduced. In terms of the entire document, in 1970, other elements started to be added to the front of the map, including things like a mileage chart, border grid system, and list of state parks and historical areas. These additions added functionality but cluttered the document itself. So this is a snippet from the current map. Overall, it's great. It's legible, and you can definitely use it to get from point A to point B. On the other hand, it's fallen victim to some of the classic pitfalls of GIS maps. Bright colors, sometimes more information than we know what to do with, which can lead to a slightly claustrophobic feeling map. It certainly does the job as a navigational tool. However, in 2020, with the rise of smartphones and widespread use of things like Google Maps, highway maps are entering a new phase. I wanted to study the maps to see how they could be updated to reclaim some of the cartographic styles from the early years, as well as add resources for underserved groups. Taking all of this into consideration, this is the map that I ended up with. My aim was to reintroduce some of the past cartographic themes, like the bold primary colors. I also toned down some of the other elements to give the entire map more white space and feel less cluttered, while keeping in mind that to keep the map accessible to colorblind folks, I had to ensure that each feature had a unique symbol. I also removed a few of the 181 lakes that had been included to give other elements space. I recognize that things such as railroads, unincorporated towns, and water bodies can be used as navigational landmarks in rural Minnesota, so it was a major goal to make the map feel less cluttered while still including important local features. So the main goal of this project was to create an alternative Minnesota state highway map, but that did get cut a little bit short by the pandemic. I'll still discuss some of the findings that we had anyways. So our most important question to ask was what's missing from the current map. We addressed the lack of representation in tourism imagery, but we must also consider what resources are missing from the map itself. There's ample information for traveling the state by personal vehicle, but a lack of information on how to navigate by public transit. And the addition of bus or train routes around the state would be useful. There's information on sites designated historical by the Minnesota Historical Society, but no indication of our state's Indigenous history. With the collaboration of Indigenous communities, the addition of ceded territories and traditional names would be valuable for representation. Minnesota also has large immigrant populations, so a map designed to welcome and educate these new Minnesotans would certainly be helpful. Along this line, there are many Minnesotans whose first language is not English. Versions of the map with vital information in Somali or Spanish would be both useful and welcoming. So the next step would obviously be to finish up that big map. Recalling themes of feminist data visualization, one of the most important and relevant to this project is to embrace pluralism. The most complete knowledge comes from synthesizing multiple perspectives with priority given to local, Indigenous, and experiential ways of knowing. For this project, then, it would be wildly valuable to interview people from around the state. I understand that I personally only have the literature that I've read and my own lived experience to inform this map redesign. A much more complete understanding of the needs of the state's residents could be achieved by interviewing different people around the state, including Indigenous folks, lifelong Minnesotans, new transplants, residents from both urban and rural areas, immigrants, and people from all different ages and socioeconomic classes. By collecting knowledge from the community that would actually be using the maps, we could achieve our overall goal of creating a truly impactful and useful resource. Thanks so much for listening.